It's the early morning hours of December 17, 1944.
The sun hasn't quite broken the horizon over the rolling Belgian countryside, and the landscape is covered in a thick blanket of frost. Somewhere in that fog and darkness, a young German officer is about to discover something that will crystallize an uncomfortable truth he's been trying to ignore for months. His name is Jochen Peiper, and at just 29 years old, he commands one of the most formidable military units Germany has assembled. Kampfgruppe Peiper, a battle group comprising nearly 5,000 of Germany's most elite SS soldiers, along with over 100 tanks and assault guns. They're the spearhead of Operation Herbstnbel, what the world would know as the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate gamble to turn around a war that everyone except Hitler himself knew was lost.
But Peiper doesn't know he's about to lose yet.
His unit has achieved something remarkable over the past 24 hours.
They've punched through American lines.
They've advanced nearly 20 miles into Belgium. They've smashed resistance at villages like Hansfeld and Blingen, capturing supplies and vehicles, proving that even in December 1944, German soldiers could still move with terrifying speed and purpose. His orders are clear. Reach the Meuse River, cross it, and drive on to Antwerp. The distance is roughly 70 miles. It's a bold objective, but Peiper believes it's possible. He's never backed down from a difficult mission in his entire military career. What Peiper doesn't know, as he stands in the pre-dawn darkness, is that he's about to run into something that no amount of courage or tactical skill can overcome.
He's about to collide with the reality of industrial warfare in the 20th century.
He's about to discover that he's fighting not an enemy army, but an entire industrial machine. And in roughly 8 hours, as his column approaches the town of Hansfeld, he's going to find something that will shatter his last illusions about Germany's chances in this war. He's going to find an American fuel depot.
50,000 gallons of gasoline, just sitting there, abandoned.
And that discovery will teach him something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. That his enemy, the Americans, have so much fuel they can afford to destroy millions of gallons rather than let it fall into German hands. That his enemy consumes more fuel in a single day than Germany receives in a month.
That his enemy doesn't even know what scarcity means. This is the story of how logistics defeated tactics. How production overwhelmed courage. How one German officer's discovery of American abundance led him to understand something that would reshape how the world thinks about warfare. That in the age of machines, wars are won by factories and refineries, not by brilliant generals or elite soldiers. The German fuel crisis. A nation running on fumes. To understand the desperation that drove Germany to launch the Ardennes Offensive in December 1944, you have to understand the fuel situation that Germany was facing. By the fall of 1944, Germany was experiencing an unprecedented energy crisis. This wasn't a matter of poor planning or miscalculation, though there was plenty of that. This was a fundamental structural problem built into Germany's entire military-industrial complex. Germany had always been an oil-poor nation.
When Hitler came to power in 1933, Germany had virtually no natural crude oil reserves. The nation was dependent on coal for most of its energy, and while Germany had abundant coal reserves, coal couldn't be easily converted into the liquid fuel that a modern mechanized army required. A horse could eat oats, but a panzer tank needed gasoline.
And that was Germany's problem.
Starting in the 1920s, German scientists and engineers, particularly those working for the chemical giant IG Farben, had developed a remarkable technology.
The ability to convert coal directly into gasoline through a process called coal hydrogenation.
By heating coal at extremely high temperatures and pressures, using hydrogen derived from water or ammonia, they could create synthetic petroleum products. It was an extraordinary technical achievement, and it bought Germany the ability to wage mechanized warfare at all. The first synthetic fuel plant opened at Luna in 1927, and by 1933, with Nazi rearmament ramping up, Hitler poured massive resources into expanding synthetic fuel capacity. By the start of World War II, Germany had 12 coal hydrogenation plants producing what the Germans called benzene synthetic gasoline. These plants were distributed across the Reich, with Luna being the crown jewel, producing roughly 13% of Germany's total synthetic fuel capacity.
The idea was sound.
Germany couldn't import oil from the Soviet Union or Romania as reliably as it wanted, but it could make its own fuel from the coal beneath the German earth. The problem was that synthetic fuel production was expensive, complicated, and extremely vulnerable to disruption.
It required enormous amounts of electricity, water, and precision engineering. It produced fuel at a fraction of the efficiency of natural crude oil refining. And most importantly, it was centralized.
Every major synthetic fuel plant was tied to coal sources and power plants, creating a logistical chain that was inherently fragile. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, they initially captured oil fields in Romania and the Caucasus, and they had some success.
By 1943, German fuel production had actually reached its peak.
The 12 hydrogenation plants combined with captured Romanian oil sources created a total supply of about 124 million barrels of oil per day capacity. For a brief moment, it seemed like Germany's fuel problem was solved. But then came May 12, 1944. On that single day, the United States Army Air Force launched the first of what would become a relentless, systematic bombing campaign against Germany's synthetic fuel plants.
The target was Luna.
The American bombers came in waves, and they dropped their loads directly on the facility. The damage was massive.
The plant's production plummeted.
German engineers worked frantically to repair the damage, and they made impressive progress. In fact, Germany's engineers managed to restore a significant portion of Luna's production capacity despite the bombing.
But there was a problem. The Allies kept coming back.
Again and again, throughout the summer and fall of 1944, American and British bombers returned to attack the synthetic fuel plants.
They attacked Luna repeatedly. They attacked the Blechhammer plant in Upper Silesia. They attacked Palitz in northern Germany. They attacked Ludwigshafen.
Each raid caused damage that required weeks or months to repair.
Each raid disrupted production.
And crucially, each successful raid degraded Germany's ability to recover. By September 1944, German synthetic fuel production had collapsed to only 5,000 barrels per day, a 90% reduction from peak capacity. In October, production inched back up to 6,000 barrels per day.
By November, it had fallen again. The mathematics were devastating.
Germany was trying to sustain mechanized warfare across an entire continent, with factories in Germany, units in France, operations in the Balkans, and defensive lines across Eastern Europe.
It was consuming hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel every single day.
And now, production had fallen so far that Germany was essentially living hand to mouth, dependent entirely on the reserves it had stored and whatever fuel it could capture from its enemies.
This wasn't just an inconvenience.
This was an existential crisis.
The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was already beginning to ground aircraft because there wasn't enough aviation fuel.
German pilots who had flown 200, 300, even 400 hours of missions in previous years were now being given training with only 60 hours in the air before being sent into combat against experienced American and British pilots who had hundreds of hours of training. German tank drivers were forced to practice with severely rationed fuel, degrading their training. German soldiers were beginning to see horses pulling wagons at the front lines again, not because Germany was nostalgic for the old ways, but because they didn't have the fuel to run trucks and transport vehicles.
At home, the civilian population hadn't seen private automobiles on the roads since 1942.
Gasoline was so precious, so completely unavailable, that the Gestapo was actually investigating black market theft of individual liters of fuel. Farmers across Germany were returning to horse-drawn plows because the fuel situation made tractors impossible to operate. The entire German economy was being slowly strangled.
The collapse of synthetic fuel production. The decision that sealed Germany's fate. To fully understand how desperate Germany's situation had become, you need to understand what happened inside the highest levels of the German government in the autumn of 1944. There was a man named Albert Speer, the brilliant, ambitious Minister of Armaments and War Production, and in June 1944, he delivered a report to Hitler that should have changed everything. The report was clear, detailed, and mathematically damning. It laid out in precise terms what the bombing campaign was accomplishing. It showed that Germany's synthetic fuel production, even at peak capacity before the bombing, couldn't actually meet Germany's wartime fuel requirements. Germany was spending more fuel than it was producing.
The gap was being covered by drawing down reserves and by capturing fuel from conquered territories. But now that the Allies were on the offensive, now that Germany was losing ground, the supply of captured fuel was drying up. And with synthetic production collapsing under the bombing campaign, Germany faced a future with no fuel at all. Speer was not a man given to alarmism. He was tough, practical, and deeply committed to the German war effort. But his report was a plea for realism. It argued that Germany needed to immediately scale back military operations. It argued that Germany should focus on defense, on preserving what it could, rather than attempting any major offensive operations. Because a major offensive would consume fuel faster than it could possibly be produced or captured, and when the fuel ran out and it would run out, the offensive would collapse, stranded and immobile.
Hitler's response was to reject Speer's conclusions out of hand.
Hitler insisted the numbers were propaganda. Hitler insisted that the bombing campaign couldn't possibly be as effective as Speer claimed.
Hitler decided that what Germany needed was not retrenchment but a bold counteroffensive. And where did Hitler decide to punch back at the Allies?
In the Ardennes, in Belgium, during the winter when weather would prevent Allied air superiority from being deployed.
The Germans called the plan Operation Herbstnebel, Operation Autumn Fog.
The Allies would call it the Battle of the Bulge. And it represented one of the most fateful decisions of the entire war. A massive gamble, predicated entirely on capturing Allied fuel supplies, launched despite the fact that Germany's own fuel production was in free fall.
Jochen Peiper,
the rising star of the Waffen-SS. To understand what happens next in this story, you need to understand who Jochen Peiper was.
He wasn't just any German colonel.
He was, by almost any measure, one of the most talented, most decorated, and most formidable combat commanders the Waffen-SS produced during the entire war. Peiper was born in 1915, which meant he was only 29 years old when he took command of Kampfgruppe in December 1944. In terms of his Rankobersturmbannführer, which was equivalent to a lieutenant colonel, was already commanding a force of extraordinary power for such a young man. But he hadn't gotten there by luck or political connections. He'd gotten there by being genuinely, extraordinarily good at his job. Peiper had spent the previous years of the war serving on the Eastern Front, where he'd earned a fearsome reputation. He'd commanded armored forces in some of the most brutal, complex operations on the entire European theater. In June 1944, just days before the D-Day landings, he'd been awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, one of the highest military decorations Germany awarded.
This wasn't a political honor.
This was a decoration given to soldiers who had demonstrated exceptional bravery and tactical skill in combat. By January 1945, after the Ardennes campaign, he would be awarded an even higher honor: the Knight's Cross with swords, adding to his earlier decoration.
Peiper's soldiers respected him intensely.
He was charismatic, intelligent, and he had a reputation for never asking his men to do something he wasn't willing to do himself.
He was calm under fire.
He understood mechanized warfare in a way that many German officers didn't. He was exactly the kind of commander you would choose to lead a desperate, ambitious, high-stakes offensive operation.
But here's the crucial thing. Peiper was not naive. He was not ideologically blinded.
He had been on the Eastern Front. He had seen the sheer scope of Soviet production.
He had seen Red Army soldiers with fresh uniforms and well-maintained equipment while German soldiers wore worn uniforms and carried aging weapons.
He understood, on a visceral level, what industrial disparity meant in modern warfare. On December 14, 1944, just 2 days before the offensive was scheduled to begin, Peiper attended the final briefing at Tondorf. His commanding general, Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, was blunt in his instructions. "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies," Dietrich told him.
Let that sink in for a moment.
The general, at the final briefing, was essentially telling his spearhead unit that success depended entirely on finding and capturing enemy fuel. He wasn't saying, "You'll have plenty of fuel, now go win." He was saying, "You probably won't have enough fuel, so you need to capture some."
Kampfgruppe paper received a fuel allocation of 31,000 gallons.
That sounds like a lot, and in the context of German logistics by late 1944, it was actually a significant allocation. But it was only enough for approximately 50 miles of combat operations.
The distance to the Meuse River was 65 miles.
Even if everything went perfectly, even if there were no delays, even if there was no resistance, Peiper's unit would run out of fuel before reaching the objective. The mathematics of failure were built into the plan from the beginning.
The American industrial machine.
An enemy of incomprehensible scale. To understand the absolute magnitude of the disaster that was about to unfold for Germany, you need to understand what American production looked like in 1944. You need to understand, in concrete terms, what it meant to be fighting against the United States. In 1944, the United States produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil.
That's not 1,000 barrels. That's not million barrels. That's billion with a B.
The entire United States petroleum production apparatus was operating at such massive scale that the country was producing petroleum products faster than the government could figure out what to do with them. American refineries were so efficient and so numerous that they were experimenting with new byproducts of the refining process simply because they had excess crude oil with nowhere to put it. This wasn't a country rationing fuel. This was a country with a surplus. Compare that to Germany's situation. Germany, in 1944, managed to produce roughly 33 million barrels of oil total, including all of its synthetic fuel production and whatever it could extract from captured Romanian fields and Hungarian oil fields.
33 million barrels. That meant the United States was producing roughly 55 times more oil than Germany. Not twice as much.
Not 10 times as much.
55 times as much.
The disparity in aviation fuel production was even more stark. The United States had pioneered a refining technique called catalytic cracking that allowed American refineries to produce incredibly high-octane gasoline with extraordinary efficiency.
American fighters and bombers were powered by engines designed to run on 100-octane fuel.
German aircraft, by contrast, were increasingly being forced to operate on 87-octane synthetic fuel. The quality difference meant that American pilots had better engine performance, better reliability, better climbing capability.
It gave American aircraft an inherent advantage over German aircraft that German pilots couldn't overcome through skill alone.
And the production numbers for aviation fuel were staggering. The United States ramped its 100-octane fuel production from 40,000 barrels per day in 1940 to 514,000 barrels per day by 1945.
500,000 barrels per day.
For a single grade of fuel.
But petroleum production was just one piece of the puzzle.
The real American advantage came from something even more fundamental. The United States was able to produce virtually everything else at scales that Germany couldn't match. In 1944, the United States was producing a new military aircraft every 5 minutes.
Every 5 minutes.
Germany's aircraft plants, despite being desperately important to the war effort, were producing maybe a handful of aircraft per day.
The United States was producing a new tank every 7 minutes.
A new ship was launched from American shipyards every single day. The comparison of total industrial production is almost incomprehensible. By 1944, the United States accounted for roughly 50% of all global manufacturing. Germany, the most industrial power in Europe, was producing at a fraction of American capacity. And when you factor in the Soviet Union, which was also producing at enormous scale despite the ongoing war on its territory, the mathematical disparity becomes almost surreal. This wasn't just a matter of quantity, either.
American production was organized with an efficiency that Germany couldn't match. American weapons were standardized. American parts were interchangeable.
American supply lines were organized into systems that could be explained on a chalkboard and then replicated across the entire army. German weapons, by contrast, were often manufactured individually or in small batches. A German panzer division might have a dozen different tank models, each requiring different ammunition, different spare parts, different maintenance procedures. A German commander might have French tanks mixed in with German-built vehicles, Soviet-captured trucks mixed in with German trucks. Each type required different fuel qualities, different oil, different maintenance schedules. The logistical complexity was exponentially higher than anything the American Army had to deal with. When you drove a Sherman tank, you could expect to find replacement parts at any American supply depot in Europe. When you drove a Tiger tank, you were one mechanical failure away from becoming immobilized, because spare parts for Tiger tanks were manufactured in Germany and then had to be shipped across the Atlantic and across France to reach you. The efficiency differential extended to every level of operations. The United States Army's supply organization in Europe in December 1944 was a marvel of modern logistics. The Army was using a system called the Red Ball Express, a dedicated truck convoy system with dedicated routes, marked with red balls to distinguish
them from regular traffic.
Nearly 6,000 2.5-ton trucks, at peak operation, were moving supplies round the clock from the ports in Normandy and later from the port of Antwerp all the way to the forward depots near the front lines. The Red Ball Express, by itself, was consuming enormous amounts of fuel. These trucks themselves burned roughly 40 gallons of fuel per day per truck just to operate, but the system was delivering approximately 12,000 to 20,000 tons of supplies daily. That included ammunition, rations, medical supplies, replacement parts, and enormous quantities of fuel.
On top of the truck convoy system, the United States had pioneered something called Operation Pluto Pipeline under the ocean.
British engineers, working with American support, had laid flexible submarine pipelines across the English Channel in the weeks following D-Day. By December 1944, the Pluto system was delivering 1 million gallons of fuel per day directly to France via pipeline, bypassing the vulnerability of ships and the complications of port operations. It was an extraordinary engineering achievement, and it meant that as long as the pipeline infrastructure remained intact, the American Army would have a consistent, protected supply of fuel flowing directly into the combat zone. When you put all of this together, the oil production, the refining capacity, the truck convoy systems, the pipelines, the organizational efficiency, you begin to understand what American logistics capability actually meant. An American general like Courtney Hodges or Omar Bradley or George Patton didn't have to worry about fuel the way Peiper had to worry about fuel. American generals had to worry about traffic jams caused by having too many vehicles trying to use the same roads at the same time. By December 1944, American First Army was consuming approximately 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day, and receiving approximately 1.4 million gallons per day. The American Army was literally accumulating fuel reserves while fighting a major military campaign. It was moving forward, pushing back the Germans, and simultaneously building up stockpiles for the next phase of operations.
The offensive begins.
December 16, the moment everything was set in motion, the attack came before dawn on December 16, 1944. The German artillery barrage that opened Operation Herbstnbel was one of the most massive concentrations of firepower Germany had managed to assemble in months. The gun batteries opened up at 5:30 in the morning, and for 2 hours, the shells continued to rain down. For the first few hours, it was genuinely shocking to American forces. No one had expected an offensive of this scale. Everyone had assumed Germany was finished, that the war would be won through a slow, grinding advance into Germany over the winter, with maybe a breakthrough in the spring of 1945. Instead, German forces, 3 entire armies coordinated for what was supposed to be a surprise attack, punched across the Belgian border and into the American lines. In the initial hours and days, it actually worked. German forces achieved what military strategists call surprise. They caught the American forces off balance.
Some American units were surrounded. Some American units broke and retreated.
In the northern sector, where Kampfgruppe Peiper was operating as the spearhead, German forces advanced more rapidly than they had at any time since the breakout from Normandy in July.
But here's the crucial thing.
From the very beginning, the German offensive was chronically behind schedule. The roads in the Ardennes, which appeared on German maps as major highways, turned out to be narrow country lanes, many of them unpaved. The terrain, which was supposed to be relatively open, turned out to be heavily forested. Weather conditions were poor.
American engineers, even when they were in retreat, had the presence of mind to blow bridges behind them.
And most importantly, the American soldiers, even when they were outnumbered, even when they were facing superior numbers of tanks, refused to break.
One small example.
At Lanzarote, Peiper's first major objective, his advance was held up by an American intelligence and reconnaissance platoon.
18 men.
18 American soldiers held up the most powerful German armored column for nearly 10 hours. Peiper's vehicles sat there, running their engines, burning fuel, while his commanders figured out how to work around this small group of American soldiers.
Peiper was getting frustrated. He was falling behind schedule. He was burning fuel at an alarming rate.
And he was realizing that covering 65 miles to the Meuse River was going to be harder than he'd anticipated. His division was going to have to fight for every mile. And every mile they fought for meant burning fuel at rates that were unsustainable. By the time Kampfgruppe Peiper reached Hansfeld on the morning of December 17, having advanced only about 20 miles, Peiper's unit had already consumed 40% of its fuel allocation. At this rate, they would run dry well before reaching the halfway point to the objective.
The discovery.
50,000 gallons at Hansfeld. Hansfeld was a small American supply depot. By the standards of major American logistics operations, it was basically nothing what the American Army classified as a Class 3B depot, which was a temporary forward supply point for the 99th Infantry Division.
The depot didn't contain any ammunition, no food, no equipment.
It was purely a fuel station. The Americans had filled it with gasoline and then evacuated it when they learned that German forces were approaching.
When Peiper's force rolled into Hansfeld that morning, what they found there exceeded the monthly fuel allocation for an entire German panzer division. Let's pause here and really understand what that means.
Imagine a military organization that's so poor for fuel that an entire armored division with dozens of tanks, hundreds of vehicles, thousands of soldiers receives a monthly allocation that seems impossibly small. Now imagine that a single forward American supply depot, not even a major installation, just a temporary fuel station, contains more fuel than that entire monthly allocation.
That's the disparity we're talking about. Hanskuller, Peiper's adjutant, later testified about what they found.
We found pyramids of jerry cans, each containing 5 gallons of gasoline. They were stacked 3 meters high, extending for perhaps 200 meters.
The Americans had not even attempted to destroy them.
Just rows and rows and rows of fuel containers.
Not hidden. Not buried. Not even disabled or contaminated. Just sitting there, ready to use. The fuel itself was American high-octane aviation gasoline mixed with motor fuel, 80 octane or higher. German vehicles, particularly the temperamental Maybach engines and the Tiger tanks, were designed to run on 74-octane fuel. The American gasoline was actually too good, too high octane, for German tank engines.
Some German vehicles experienced engine problems when they started using the American fuel. This was a kind of poetic problem. They had captured too much fuel of too high a quality.
Peiper's men set to work immediately.
They began transferring fuel from the American jerry cans into German tanks and vehicles.
They counted the fuel as they moved it.
The numbers were staggering. They counted 50,000 gallons.
50,000 gallons. That was enough fuel to keep Kampfgruppe Peiper in operation for the next phase of the offensive. It was enough to cover the remaining distance to the Meuse.
It was enough to potentially change the course of the campaign. For a few hours, Peiper allowed himself to believe that his luck was changing. That the offensive might actually work. That Germany might actually be able to pull off this impossible maneuver.
But there were other things in that American depot besides fuel. There were shipping manifests in the office. One of Peiper's men, Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, could read English. Worked in his father's import business before the war. He pulled those manifests and translated them. They showed the journey of this fuel. It had been shipped from Texas to New York. Then across the Atlantic to Liverpool, England. Then across the English Channel to Normandy. Then trucked 400 miles to Hansfeld.
The entire journey, from oilfield to forward American supply depot, had taken less than 6 weeks.
Hoffmann showed the manifests to Peiper.
According to eyewitness accounts from 1976, Peiper read them twice, then crumpled them up.
He said nothing.
But his face went pale. Hoffman, watching him, understood immediately what had struck Peiper so deeply. If the Americans could move fuel this distance, in this quantity, in 6 weeks, if they could afford to abandon this much fuel in a forward depot, then the Americans' logistics capability was on a scale that Germany simply couldn't match. And there was more. Private Ernst Gara found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated December 15, just 2 days old. The headlines celebrated the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun. The pipeline was capable of delivering 300,000 gallons per day.
A single pipeline delivering more fuel daily than Kampfgruppe Peiper would consume in the entire offensive. The realization dawns.
The moment the myth shattered, this is where the story transforms from a military narrative into something deeper. This is the moment when a brilliant, experienced military commander begins to understand something that cuts to the very core of what he's fighting for and what he's fighting against.
Peiper was not stupid.
He had seen the Eastern Front. He had fought against the Soviet Union. He understood industrial capacity. But seeing numbers on a report about German versus
American production was one thing.
Standing in an American supply depot, looking at row after row after row of fuel containers, picking up newspapers celebrating new pipeline capacity, looking at shipping manifests that showed fuel traveling around the world in 6 weeks, this was something else entirely.
This was reality, visceral and undeniable.
At that moment, Peiper began to understand something that would shape his perception of the war for the rest of his life. He began to understand that Germany hadn't just miscalculated.
Germany hadn't just made strategic errors. Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of its enemy.
Germany had prepared for a war of short duration, fought with mobility and speed. Germany had built a military machine optimized for rapid conquest, for using tanks and aircraft to overwhelm enemies before supply lines became a problem.
This had worked in 1940, in France. It had almost worked in 1941, against the Soviet Union.
But it couldn't work against an enemy that could sustain operations indefinitely through sheer production capacity.
The United States wasn't like Germany. The United States wasn't like any enemy Germany had faced. The United States was an enemy that could afford to abandon fuel supplies. An enemy that could destroy 8 million gallons of fuel rather than let it be captured.
An enemy that could consume fuel so fast, in such vast quantities, that an advanced enemy position represented a rounding error in the calculation of daily consumption. As the day progressed, Peiper pushed his force forward. He reached Billingen by noon on December 17, capturing additional supplies, more ammunition, more rations, more fuel. And crucially, he captured American maps showing other fuel depots in the region. The maps revealed something that would have terrified a logistics officer who understood the implications. The Americans had fuel stockpiles everywhere.
Every major crossroads had a depot.
The American First Army alone had 3.5 million gallons in reserve, scattered across dozens of locations.
Peiper pushed on, driving deeper into Belgian territory.
His spearhead continued to advance, continued to achieve tactical success. But the arithmetic of the campaign was becoming increasingly clear. They were consuming fuel faster than they could capture it. They were moving deeper into enemy territory, which meant their supply lines were getting longer and more vulnerable.
And they were running out of time. The Stavelot Fuel Depot.
The lesson that changed everything by December 17, as evening fell, Peiper's spearhead had advanced deep enough to spot a major American fuel installation.
The Stavelot Depot.
This was a large-scale facility, not a forward supply point like Hansfeld. This was a major fuel storage site.
It contained over 2 million gallons of gasoline. With 2 million gallons, Peiper could guarantee reaching the Meuse and potentially pushing beyond it. With 2 million gallons, the entire campaign calculus changed.
Peiper approached the town cautiously, aware that major American installations would be defended. But as his forces closed in on December 17, something remarkable happened.
The Americans didn't fight for the depot.
The Americans destroyed it instead. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received warning that German forces were approaching. His orders were unambiguous.
deny the fuel to the enemy at all costs.
At 4:30 in the afternoon on December 17, as Peiper's advanced guard closed in on the perimeter, Brewster gave the order. His engineers poured gasoline trails between the stacks of jerry cans. They distributed white phosphorus grenades. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis threw the first grenade. The explosion was immediate and tremendous. According to Solis' testimony, a wall of fire shot up maybe 100 feet.
Within minutes, the entire depot was engulfed in flames.
The fire would burn for 3 days, consuming enough fuel to power Peiper's entire division to Antwerp and back. Unterfuhr of Bear, Peiper's driver, was there when the flames erupted. He described the scene. Peiper stood on his tank turret watching the flames rise 1,000 feet into the sky.
He said nothing for perhaps 5 minutes.
Then he climbed down and turned to Bear. "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to deny them to us," he said quietly.
"What are we doing here?" It was a moment of crystalline clarity. The lesson was unmistakable. The Americans didn't value fuel the way Germans value fuel. The Americans didn't hoard fuel the way Germans would have hoarded fuel.
The Americans could casually destroy millions of gallons of fuel, could afford to take the loss, because their production capacity was so vast that the destruction was inconvenient but not catastrophic.
If you burned the Hansfeld depot, and the Americans did, though not in the same dramatic way, the Americans would still be receiving 1.4 million gallons per day through their supply system. If you burned Stavelot, it barely dented American logistics operations. And the Germans immediately understood the implications of this. Across the Ardennes, American engineers were implementing a consistent policy:
destroy all fuel supplies that were threatened by German capture. At Trier, 1.1 million gallons burned.
At Spa, 2.5 million gallons were destroyed.
In total, during the first week of the offensive, the Americans deliberately destroyed over 8 million gallons of fuel.
More than Germany had allocated for the entire operation. The mathematics of defeat.
When the numbers become inescapable, let's talk about the mathematics of this campaign, because the numbers tell a story that is absolutely devastating to German hopes. Major Friedrich Simmann of the Wehrmacht's Logistics Command had calculated before the offensive that the Ardennes campaign would require 4.5 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp.
Hitler authorized 5 million gallons of fuel for the operation.
But and this is crucial, only half of the authorized fuel was actually delivered. The transportation systems were overwhelmed.
The roads were congested.
The fuel depots couldn't move the fuel fast enough. So the German army went into the offensive with approximately 2.5 million gallons of fuel allocated, knowing they needed 4.5 million.
The gap was supposed to be made up by captured enemy supplies.
The Germans were gambling their entire offensive on being able to capture American fuel.
Let's compare this to the American situation. On December 16, the day the offensive began, the American First Army had 3.7 million gallons in reserve. December 17, the Americans deliberately destroyed 2.2 million gallons at Stavelot and other locations. You might think this would be catastrophic. You might think losing 2.2 million gallons would cripple American operations.
But December 18, the American First Army received 1.8 million gallons of new supplies. And December 24, 8 days into the campaign, American First Army reserves stood at 4.1 million gallons.
The Americans had destroyed enough fuel to supply Peiper's entire operation, and they had already replaced it. They had literally burned more fuel in a week than Germany had allocated for the entire campaign, and they didn't even feel it. Meanwhile, Peiper's unit was consuming fuel at alarming rates.
Tiger tanks consumed 2.5 gallons per mile in battle conditions.
Panthers burned 1.5 gallons per mile.
In the difficult, forested terrain of the Ardennes, fuel consumption increased by 40%. By December 18, Peiper's unit had consumed 67,000 gallons since the offensive began. They had captured perhaps 55,000 gallons. They were operating at a deficit. The gap was growing. The mathematics were deteriorating every single day. By December 19, the fuel crisis was acute. Tanks were being abandoned not because they were damaged, not because they'd been destroyed by enemy fire, but because they were out of fuel. The German army was literally leaving functional vehicles behind because there was no fuel to run them. Peiper consolidated his remaining fuel, perhaps 8,000 gallons, barely enough for one engagement, certainly not enough for both attack and retreat.
And then came another blow.
On December 20th, Peiper received a radio message. The resupply convoy that had been promised was destroyed by Allied aircraft.
No additional fuel would be arriving. Continue with available resources.
Peiper called his commanders together.
The assessment was devastating.
They had fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers.
The Meuse was 30 kilometers away.
And that's if nothing went wrong, if there was no fighting, if they could somehow drive in a straight line without deviation.
According to Grüller's testimony, Peiper addressed his commanders.
"Gentlemen, we have discovered we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this entire operation. What we captured at Hansfeld, which seemed miraculous, was nothing to them.
We cannot win." The collapse.
When logistics overcome courage, the situation deteriorated rapidly. By December 21st, Kampfgruppe Peiper was surrounded by American forces from the 31st Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne Division, and the 3rd Armored Division. Peiper's unit, which had begun the offensive with over 100 tanks and assault guns, now had perhaps 40 tanks that were still operational but immobilized due to lack of fuel. American forces surrounding him had a combined fuel allocation for December 21st alone of 340,000 gallons. Peiper had perhaps 1,000 gallons.
Think about that disparity. Think about what?
It means when you're surrounded and your enemy, the force surrounding you, has fuel allocated for that single day that's 340 times what you have for your entire encircled force. An American soldier, Private First Class Richard McKinney, wrote home describing the scene.
"We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas.
Our captain jokes we use more fuel heating coffee than they have for tanks."
The American response to the encirclement demonstrated industrial warfare at its absolute peak.
General George Patton's Third Army pivoted north to relieve the 101st Airborne Division at Bastogne, a maneuver that required 350,000 gallons of fuel just for the redeployment. The maneuver was considered operationally impossible by German standards. It was moving an entire army across the map, refueling vehicles on the go, establishing new supply lines, all in less than a week. Yet the Americans accomplished it in 3 days.
Because they had the fuel.
Because they had the logistical capacity.
Because they were an industrial machine that could absorb and redirect vast quantities of resources on a whim.
On December 23, the weather cleared, and Allied aircraft could finally operate in strength.
2,000 sorties were flown that day. P-47 Thunderbolts consumed 300 gallons per hour.
B-26 bombers burned 200 gallons per hour.
One day's air operations one single day consumed more aviation fuel than Germany's entire offensive allocation.
On the night of December 23 to 24, Peiper abandoned his vehicles and escaped on foot with roughly 770 men out of the original 5,000. The remaining armored vehicles couldn't go anywhere. They were immobilized. So Peiper took the fuel that remained, maybe 200 gallons total, extracted it from all the vehicles, destroyed the tanks with remaining ammunition, and then moved on foot through American lines back toward German territory. Of the 119 tanks and assault guns that began the offensive, 39 remained operational but immobilized.
These were destroyed, not by enemy tanks, not by aircraft, not by artillery, but by running out of fuel. Millions of Reichsmarks worth of equipment, destroyed by empty fuel tanks. The ripple effect.
How one discovery reshaped understanding. Word of Peiper's discoveries spread rapidly through German command. On December 26, Field Marshal Walter Model received reports about the captured American supplies.
His chief of staff recorded Model's reaction.
The Field Marshal read the quantities twice.
50,000 gallons at Hansfeld. 2 million burned at Stavelot. 8 million destroyed rather than captured. He said, "We are not fighting the same war." It wasn't a metaphor. It was a statement of absolute fact.
Model had understood at that moment that the war Germany was fighting was not the same war that Germany had prepared for. Germany had prepared for a short, mobile war. Germany had prepared for rapid conquest and quick consolidation. Germany was now in a mechanized, industrial war of attrition against an enemy with vastly superior production capacity.
And that was a different war entirely.
When Hitler was informed, he refused to accept the reality. Speer wrote later that Hitler insisted the numbers were propaganda, that the bombing reports were exaggerated. When shown photographs of burning Stavelot, Hitler claimed they were Hollywood special effects.
But lower-ranking officers in the German army understood immediately. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann, the man who had translated the shipping manifests, wrote his wife afterward. "Americans destroy more fuel daily than we receive monthly. They drive tanks like we march. This war is lost." It wasn't defeatism. It wasn't cowardice. It was mathematics. The Gulf of Abundance.
Why American waste meant German defeat. The psychological impact of the fuel crisis extended far beyond just the military operational level. For German soldiers, seeing American abundance, American waste, American casual indifference to scarcity created a cognitive dissonance that undermined the entire ideological framework they'd been fed. German soldiers had been told for years that the Third Reich was the master race, that German culture was superior, that German engineering was superior, that German soldiers were superior. They had been told that the decadent democracies of the West were weak and soft and would crumble when confronted by Germanic strength. And then they found themselves fighting an enemy that didn't just have more tanks and more guns.
The enemy had more fuel.
The enemy had so much fuel that they could destroy millions of gallons.
The enemy had so much food that soldiers could eat chocolate without rationing. The enemy had so much gasoline that they could use it to heat water for coffee.
The enemy had so many trucks that traffic jams were the primary logistical concern, not shortages. German prisoners of war who were captured during the Ardennes campaign told interrogators about their shock at American waste.
One German NCO, Aus Ga Reichelm, told interrogators,
"We knew your production numbers abstractly, but seeing soldiers waste more than we possessed made them real. Every German who saw your casual abundance knew the war was hopeless."
The psychological impact wasn't erased by Nazi propaganda or party discipline.
German soldiers, even dedicated Nazi soldiers, even members of the elite Waffen-SS, couldn't maintain a sense of racial superiority when they were surrounded by evidence of material abundance that exceeded anything Germany could produce. Seeing American soldiers discard half-eaten rations, seeing American soldiers use gasoline for heating purposes, seeing American soldiers possess seemingly unlimited supplies, these observations shattered the myth of Germanic superiority more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have. The knowledge spread through letters home, despite censorship. Feldwebel Ernst Miller wrote, "Americans wash clothes in gasoline. They feed chocolate to dogs. They fire artillery for Christmas. We cannot fight infinity." It wasn't hyperbole. It was a description of a reality that had become psychologically undeniable. Lessons from the failure. What this battle taught the world: the Battle of the Bulge failed. The German offensive was supposed to last 6 weeks and split the Allied armies, capturing Antwerp and forcing the Allies to negotiate. Instead, the offensive was contained within 8 to 10 days, and by late January 1945, the Allies had restored their lines and were pushing forward again. But the failure wasn't primarily due to superior American tactics or more courageous American soldiers. The failure was due to logistics. The failure was due to the fundamental reality that Germany couldn't sustain a major mechanized offensive against an enemy with vastly superior production and supply capabilities. During the Nuremberg trials after the war, German military leaders repeatedly cited logistics, particularly fuel, as the decisive factor. Field Marshal Keitel testified, "We had operational superiority 1940-41. By 1944, we couldn't move forces for lack of fuel while Americans moved armies like chess pieces." Peiper himself, tried for war crimes and eventually executed in 1956, offered testimony that revealed how fuel shortage had constrained every decision. Every decision after December 17 was influenced by fuel shortage.
We couldn't maneuver, pursue, or retreat effectively. Americans moved freely while we counted leaders. General Heinz Guderian, one of Germany's greatest panzer commanders, wrote, "When Peiper captured 50,000 gallons, meaning everything to him but nothing to Americans, the war was over." The story of the Ardennes campaign, when examined through the lens of fuel and logistics, reveals something profound about modern warfare. It demonstrates that by 1944, wars between industrialized powers were no longer won by warrior courage or tactical brilliance. They were won by factories and refineries. They were won by the ability to sustain operations indefinitely through production. They were won by the nation that could afford to destroy millions of gallons of fuel rather than let it be captured. Dr. Richard Overy, a historian of World War II's production disparities, calculated that by 1944 the Allied to Axis production ratios exceeded 5-1 in most major categories. In petroleum, the ratio approached 50-1. Think about that. 50-1. That wasn't a disadvantage. That was an impossibility to overcome. During the war, the United States produced 324,750 aircraft. Germany produced 119,970. Americans built 88,410 tanks. Germany built 46,857. But most tellingly, America refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil in 1944 alone, while Germany scraped together 33 million barrels. That's not just a difference. That's a different order of magnitude entirely. The human element. How abundance defeats dedication. It's important to note that German soldiers were not inferior to American soldiers. This isn't a story about superior courage or dedication. German soldiers in 1944 were, in many respects, more experienced, better trained, and more motivated than their American counterparts. Many American soldiers were teenagers, fresh from civilian life, with minimal training. Many German soldiers were battle-hardened veterans of years of combat on the Eastern Front. But none of that mattered when you ran out of fuel. A Tiger tank was arguably the most powerful tank on the battlefield. It had armor that was thicker than anything the Americans were fielding in significant numbers. Its gun was more powerful than the standard American tank gun. In a one-on-one engagement, a Tiger tank could often defeat an American Sherman tank. But a Tiger that was out of fuel was just a fortified bunker that couldn't move. By late 1944, German tank commanders were famous for their tactical skill. American tank commanders, often with less experience, couldn't match German tactical proficiency one-on-one. But American commanders didn't have to match German skill one-on-one. American commanders had abundance. American tank companies had replacements waiting in depots. American tank divisions had dedicated fuel supply that meant they could operate aggressively, knowing that fuel would be available. American commanders could afford to absorb losses that German commanders couldn't, because replacements were always available. And this extended to every level of military operations. A German soldier's rifle was every bit as effective as an American soldier's rifle. But an American squad had machine guns, grenades, and ammunition in quantities that seemed inexhaustible. An American company had supporting fire that was more intense and more sustained than what German companies could manage. The qualitative advantages often favored Germany. But the quantitative advantages, the purely numerical abundance of American military production, created a situation where Germany couldn't win through skill and tactics alone. Germany would have needed German soldiers to be superhumanly better than American soldiers just to achieve a balance. And at some point, no amount of training or dedication can overcome a 15-1 production disadvantage. Peiper understood this. He had seen it on the Eastern Front. He had seen the Red Army replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. He understood that industrial capacity was the ultimate arbiter of victory. And at Hansfeld, when he realized that the Americans could afford to abandon 50,000 gallons of fuel without even slowing down their operations, he understood that Germany had lost. The final irony. The machines preserved, the operators abandoned. Here's an irony that crystallizes the entire situation. When American forces finally recovered the battlefield, they catalogued the abandoned German equipment.
At La Gleize, they found 39 Tiger tanks, Panthers, and other vehicles that had been abandoned solely for lack of fuel. Major Robert Harrison's salvage report noted that what was required to save these vehicles 8,000 gallons of fuel was available in the American supply system as a routine request.
8,000 gallons. The amount needed to save an entire company of the best tanks Germany had produced. The amount available to American forces as a minor logistical request using local reserves. An amount that exceeded Kampfgruppe Peiper's peak strength. This is what Peiper discovered at Hansfeld. Not just that America had more fuel, but that American abundance operated on a scale making German scarcity irrelevant. A single American supply depot, containing 8,000 gallons of fuel, was enough to save 39 German tanks. To Americans, it was barely worth noting. To Germans, it would have meant continuing the war. Conclusion.
Lessons that echo through history. The story of Jochen Peiper's discovery at Hansfeld, and the resulting collapse of the German Ardennes Offensive, contains lessons that extend far beyond World War II.
It demonstrates fundamental truths about industrial warfare that remain relevant today. First, logistics aren't boring support functions. Logistics are strategy. The general who wins is often the general who best solves the problem of moving fuel, ammunition, food, and replacements to the front lines. Napoleon famously said an army marches on its stomach, but in the 20th century and beyond, an army moves on its fuel. Everything else, tactics, courage, leadership, training, secondary to logistics.
Second, industrial capacity determines military outcomes.
No amount of tactical brilliance can overcome a 50-to-1 production disadvantage in petroleum.
No amount of courage can overcome a 15-to-1 production disadvantage in tanks and aircraft. In wars between industrialized nations, the nation with superior productive capacity will win, all other factors being roughly equal. Third, abundance creates psychological as well as military advantages. The sight of an American soldier using gasoline to heat water for coffee, the existence of American supply depots so large that fuel could be destroyed rather than captured, the simple fact that Americans could consume so much while Germans starved for so little, these created a narrative that no propaganda could overcome. The myth of Germanic superiority couldn't survive contact with American abundance. Fourth, modern warfare is a team effort at a scale that extends far beyond the combat zone. Peiper was arguably a more brilliant tactical commander than any American general.
But Peiper's brilliance was negated by the 40,000 workers in American oil fields and refineries.
It was negated by the engineers who built the Red Ball Express. It was negated by the pilots of the transport aircraft who flew supplies across the Atlantic.
The American victory wasn't won by any single general or any single dramatic battle.
It was won by an entire industrial military complex working in coordination. When Peiper stood at Hansfeld, looking at 50,000 gallons of fuel, reading shipping manifests that showed fuel traveling from Texas to Belgium in 6 weeks, understanding that the Americans could afford to burn 8 million gallons rather than let it be captured, he understood that the war was lost.
Not because his soldiers weren't brave enough. Not because his tanks weren't powerful enough.
But because he was fighting an entire nation's productive capacity, and no amount of German courage or German engineering could overcome that.
The Tiger tank at La Gleize is now a museum piece, preserved as a monument to a time when tactical excellence met logistical reality and lost. Visitors ask why such powerful tanks were abandoned. The answer is simple. No fuel. Final thoughts: if you've made it this far, you understand something about World War II that many people don't. That the war was decided not just on battlefields, but in factories, in refineries, in shipping lanes, and in supply depots. The Allies won because they could produce more, transport more, and sustain operations more effectively than the Axis powers. Germany lost because, no matter how skillfully its officers commanded, no matter how bravely its soldiers fought, it couldn't overcome the fundamental disparity in industrial capacity. This story of Jochen Peiper and his discovery at Hansfeld reminds us that in modern warfare, logistics wins wars. Courage matters. Training matters. Tactics matter. But at the end of the day, when you've run out of fuel, none of that matters anymore.
That's the story from the front lines of World War II. If this history has captivated you, the clash of empires, the strategy behind the battlefields, and the personal stories of ordinary soldiers, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are countless stories from the war that deserve to be told, and we are committed to bringing you the most compelling, well-researched narratives.
Thank you for watching WWII Frontline.